International Business, Class 2. Any questions or comments regarding last class? Feel free to post it. Let me know. We're going to jump right into international business. We're continuing globalization, and I'm continuing some of our macro thought to try to bring you up to speed, get some vernacular under your belt, and some new vocabulary. So, quickly, what is the difference? What is the distinction we make between offshoring and outsourcing? Phil, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Offshoring is for operations outside of the country, whereas
whoops, sorry. Good.
And outsourcing was we're contracting it out to China and
Or it could even be local. Outsourcing could even be local. So offshoring is your own business, your own employees in a different country, very much like Intel in, say, Ireland, or China or Costa Rica. Outsourcing is having somebody else do a function of business that you don't want to do, probably due to cost, and that could be anything from having T-shirts made across the street to outsourcing to India, maybe a call center in India. So we understand the difference between outsourcing, offshoring. We know who the manufacturer of the world is, that's China. We know who the back office of the world is, that would be India. We understand who the gateway to the United States is, that's Mexico. They have more treaties than just about any country in the entire world. We also understand that Singapore is the gateway to Asia. And let's see what else. We also talked about globalization and exactly what is globalization. What is the physical symbol of globalization? This, right? It's this. It's the threads that bind our economies together. And with that said, there are three primary threads that we discussed. We're talking about number one, finance, number two, information, and number three, technology. So those three threads are really driving globalization. Who is the primary driver of globalization as we know it? That's the question. Who might be the primary driver? What country, Phil, might be the primary driver of globalization in the world today? Excellent, Ben. Excellent, Phil. It is the U.S. and it is because of innovation. Fantastic answer. So we need to be aware that the reason why the U.S. is the most innovative, it isn't because of something in the water. Why is it? Somebody online, tell me why it is that, what precipitates innovation? What precipitates innovation? It's a double-edged sword that we talked about, and I see Tim coming up. What is it that precipitates innovation? It's the hire and fire mentality. You're absolutely right. It's the hire and fire mentality that we have. If you're not comfortable working for a company for the next 30 years, what are you going to do? You're going to come up with new ways to put food on the table, new ways to make money. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. A lot of people are unemployed in other parts of the world. Why aren't they more innovative? There's huge unemployment in other parts of the world. Well, there are also cultural differences and standard of living differences that we need to take into consideration. And I believe that it's the hire and fire mentality here in the U.S., given that we are a knowledge-based economy, scares the heck out of people in terms of being unemployed or underemployed. So that hire fire mentality precipitates innovation. Let's see. If you're going to launch into another country, quickly, what is the first rule that you're going to do? You're going to employ. What's the first rule you're going to employ if you launch into another country? And Ben, Tim, know your client, Know their clients. There you go, market research analysis. It's always important, no matter where you're at, to know your client, but to know your client's client. That's part of business development. That's really MBA and real hands-on, real-world experience. That statement there. Know your customer and know your customer's customer. And it's extremely, I can't emphasize it enough. We'll just leave it at that. Now, I also want you to be aware that if you launch into another country, you have to have a dedicated team. And we talked about it before. You have to have a dedicated team, or else you spread yourself way too thin. You spread yourself way too thin. We understand that culture is, just again, continuing the review, we understand that culture is basically a set of values and beliefs and norms of a particular people, right? And we need to understand culture. We need to have and increase our cultural IQ, primarily so that if we understand, here's the thinking, if I understand the culture, if I understand the mindset of another culture, I'm probably going to be able to tailor my advertising so that it hits an emotional trigger in that particular culture versus, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Your target market is going to be different from country to country, and it's important to recognize that you compete in culture more than you compete in countries. You compete in culture more than you compete in countries. I want you to remember that, because within a country, you could have a multiplicity of cultures. You could have numerous different cultures within a country. So in business, in international business specifically, you could have numerous cultures. You're going to have to target them. You're going to have to figure out what makes them tick. Okay? Great point, Ben. Difference between collectivists and communal societies. Are you asking a question, or is that what you're saying as that could actually be? Yeah, okay, I thought so. Yeah, you could have different types of thought process, you know, being collective versus maybe being individualistic, et cetera, et cetera. All right. As I said before, we are a knowledge-based economy in the United States. We have moved beyond the industrial age, and thus a lot of our manufacturing has gone overseas. That's caused a lot of turmoil, a lot of political buzz goes around this particular topic. People want that manufacturing back. People want that manufacturing back in the U.S. I say keep it out there. Leave it. Leave it out there. Primarily because what's being manufactured in China is lower tech items. And no one really wants their son or daughter in the United States working in a factory for the rest of their life, doing, you know, widgets, putting widgets together, something like this. And this is not a lie. I've seen this. Individuals putting caps on widgets in China all day long. What do you think the average workday is like in China? How many hours a day would you guess that a Chinese individual working in a factory will do this? Repeatedly. Repeatedly. Randy, Tim, you guys are absolutely right. 12 to 14 hours a day doing this. Do you want your family or anybody that you know doing this 12 to 14 hours a day? How many days a week? How many days a week? 7 days a week. You're absolutely right. 7 days a week. They get 1 day off a month. After an hour, I'm just being completely honest with you here, after an hour of doing that, of this, we'll say, putting this widget together like this, I would probably throw up, I would be on the ground, and I would be calling for my mom. And that's probably the reality of it. It's monotonous work. It's no-brainer type work, and I can tell you I would be in serious trouble. We don't want that. The point is we want to continue. We want to continue with high-tech manufacturing, and that's coming back. You know what's interesting is that, and this is something else that you're not aware of. Did you know that China just overtook the United States in manufacturing output in 2011, January of 2011? China manufactures about 20% of the world's goods. Did you know that here in the United States, we're at about 19.5%? We still have a huge percentage of manufacturing, and it's growing yet again. You would think that we do maybe 1 or 2% of the manufacture of the world's goods with all of the media hype around this subject. They just passed us, literally, in 2011, January of 2011. An interesting statistic, very interesting number. Is that worse than being unemployed? I forgot the question. I forgot the question where we're at. Oh yeah, I think I would rather. I hate to say this. I think I'd rather be unemployed than to work 14 hours a day doing this. That I could probably figure out how to make more money being unemployed than I would working in China for a few pennies an hour doing this. Yeah, that's probably worse than being unemployed, but that's a funny statement. Okay, what are some of the challenges? We didn't talk about this. What are some of the challenges with globalization? What are some of the problems that you might think of right now at the top of your head? What are some of the problems that globalization brings? Do you have anything, Phil?
The lack of regulations and workers, I guess you could say, like, workers' rights.
Lack of regulations, lack of workers' rights. That's absolutely the exploitation of individuals in other countries. You know, I immediately, what's that? Oh, I forget the lady's name who several years ago was having apparel made, and she's on some show now, and I forget. Anyway, she got in a lot of trouble. Time zone differences, cultural difference, cost to ship goods. Those are actually all business thoughts, and I appreciate what you guys are saying, Ben and Tim. But what we're really talking about is what Phil said. You have this mentality, and it's called the race to the bottom. The race to the bottom. And if you notice up here, you know, here's the hegemon. And then underneath here, you have all of the other countries. The race to the bottom is the lowest cost to manufacture, really trying to get into another triangle. Yes, another triangle. I'm a triangular wizard. Lowest cost. Countries are constantly looking to go to countries where they can get the lowest cost of production. And it's called the race to the bottom. China used to be, for a while there, the lowest cost producer. But wages are starting to go up. You're starting to see more regulatory in terms of children working or not being able to work, or you know, hopefully they're not. but you're starting to see more and more of, we'll call it Americanization, filter into China. And so just real time right now, who might you think, what country might you think is the next race to the bottom? What country is it that MNCs, multinational corporations, are driving to get into right now? India? No. Taiwan? No. Taiwan's been a fairly established manufacturer for years. These are good guesses. Brazil? No. It's Vietnam right now. I have a buddy of mine, he's the vice president of Werner Ladders. Werner Ladders. And they make 85% of the world's ladders. So if you have a ladder at your house, there's an 85% chance that it's a Werner ladder. They are moving into Vietnam, as are numerous other MNCs. And the benefit is the manufacturing cost is ridiculously low. Ridiculously low. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. But there are problems with that. These individuals don't have any real skills or any training or understanding. Many of them are illiterate, and they don't have the skill set or knowledge base to actually produce. So these companies going in, the benefit they have is they're paying them pennies per day, pennies on the hour, we'll say, and yet now they have to train them. So that is somewhat of a large undertaking. In China now, if you want manufacturing done, you don't have to train anybody. In China, they're pretty much all plug and play. They're ready to go. They're ready to go. Vietnam right now is the next winner or loser, we'll say, in the race to the bottom. In the race to the bottom. Mexico is an interesting point you bring up, Ben. Mexico, when China came into the global marketplace again in, I believe it was 1994. They were accepted into the World Trade Organization. And before that, Mexico was one of the lowest cost producers. And geographically, they had a competitive advantage because they were right next to the United States. But Mexico was making all of the low-tech widgets, right? They were making all the low-tech widgets. China came into the scene. There's a giant vacuum sound. All of that went to China. And Mexico was left scrambling. What did we do? Where do we go from here? And their economy took a pretty big hit for a few years. They realized that they couldn't compete on the low-tech side. Mexico is quickly becoming, there are pockets like Guadalajara that are quickly becoming very, very high-tech centers. Something like Silicon Valley of Latin America is what Guadalajara is known for now. And it continues to grow. They can't compete with China. It's not the race to the bottom anymore. It's higher tech manufacturing, higher tech industry that is now their competitive advantage, or what they are working on. That's a good point. What we need to be aware of is when you're looking at manufacturing overseas, and I have manufacturing done in China right now, you have to look at total cost of ownership. So sure, you've got a very low cost in terms of wages, but what's the total cost of ownership? What's the total cost of ownership? Those are things that Tim and Ben had brought up earlier. taxes, time zone differences, the shipment time, the time it takes to get from China or Vietnam to the United States. So total cost of ownership is going to be, you're going to have things like duties and taxes that you have to pay as you bring them into the United States. You're going to have to think about inventory and how much inventory you're going to have on hand. So for instance, if you have it made in Mexico versus made in China. Well, I mentioned to you on Tuesday that from Mexico, you can get anywhere in the United States within 17 hours, easily within 24 hours by truck. Well, if you have it made in China, it's going to take 20 to 30 days, maybe 40 days, depending on that product getting to the United States. Well, that means you're going to have to keep inventory in order to sustain that, so that way you don't run out of product. There's nothing worse than selling to customers with empty store shelves, right? So you're going to have to keep inventory in place here. Well, the carrying cost on that inventory can get expensive. Think about if you're Walmart and you've got, I don't know, let's just say clothes. Well, those clothes you're going to have somewhere, wherever you're getting those clothes from, Walmart's vendors are going to have inventory so that Walmart doesn't run out. What are the carrying costs on that? You're talking about some fixed costs relating to the warehouse. You're talking about the inventory. How much money does inventory tie up? If you have to buy an extra month of inventory, so you're not doing it just in time, well, it's going to depend on how much inventory it is that you need to fulfill a Walmart order to keep the Walmart store shelves full. So you've got inventory, you've got duties, taxes, you're going to have time in terms of the time it takes to get to the United States. That's money. Time is money, right? You're going to have to possibly look at training the individuals and how to actually make something. You have to give them those skills. I mean, what is the total cost of ownership? It's not just, and this is where a lot of people, a lot of companies got really, we'll say, turned around financially when all they looked at was, wow, we're paying individuals here to manufacture our low-tech widget, we're paying them $25 an hour. You mean that we can go to Vietnam or go to China and pay them $1 an hour or $2 an hour? Wow, think of the cost we're saving. And that's the reality of how they thought. They weren't thinking of the total cost of ownership. They weren't thinking of the inventory and the carrying costs and the duties and the taxes, the time it takes to get from A to B, et cetera, et cetera. So when we think about manufacturing somewhere, we need to think of the total cost of ownership. You're going to think of how much inventory you're going to have on hand before you start manufacturing, and then the whole process. It does, Randy, you're absolutely right. It locks up capital. And Ben brought up NAFTA. That's right, the free trade between, I should say, amongst the three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And let's see here. And that segues into another topic that I want to bring up along the lines of globalization. The flag follows the dollar. Don't let politics get in the way. You know, the United States has a long history of going into countries where we have an economic interest, and maybe it's for oil, maybe it's for, well, lately it's been for oil. But the reality of it is that the flag follows the dollar. It used to be when I was a kid, you'd hear a lot of rhetoric about, we need to push democracy. We need to push democracy into these countries. Well, the reality of it is that companies wanted to or had an interest in those countries, and the instability was causing them problems and headaches, which in turn caused U.S. consumers to pay more. And Lord forbid that we have to pay more for our produce or more for our oil. And again, I'm not trying to disparage our beautiful political system, but what I am saying is, in the United States, the flag follows the dollar. Let me give you a case in point. NAFTA has been brought up, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Who was it? The question is, whose idea was NAFTA? Whose idea was NAFTA? Was it Mexico's? Was it the United States? Or was it Canada? Whose idea would it have been? And why would it have been the U.S.? Why would it be the U.S. that came up with this idea? Exactly. Who benefits the most? Who's going to benefit the most? The United States. The United States companies are going to benefit the most. Let's look at this. Let's just take a quick look at the dynamics between the three countries. So you have Canada. What is Canada known to have most of? Resources, right? They've got plenty of oil, they got plenty of timber, they've got plenty of gold, they've got a lot of everything in terms of resources. What does Mexico bring to the table? Labor. You can't do anything without this. Well, let's see who fills that spot. You can't do anything without capital. Mexico's got the labor. Canada's got the resources. It's a perfect storm. It's a perfect storm. NAFTA was implemented, and you see along the border manufacturing called maquiladoras, and you should know what these are. If you go to Nogales, on the other side are numerous manufacturing hubs. A lot of them are getting into aerospace, driven by the U.S. U.S. has the capital, they've got the labor, why not put a facility over there? And we'll sell it back to another customer, maybe in Europe or in the U.S. or wherever. You go to Juarez, huge manufacturing across the line. These maquiladoras, these manufacturing facilities, dot the entire southern border of the United States. Driven by the U.S. Think about Samsung. Think about LG Electronics. Think about Mercury Marine. All different industries, different companies. They will assemble and do a lot of manufacturing in Mexico because there's no tariff. Free trade. Free trade. North American Free Trade Agreement. So do you think that it behooves foreign companies to set up a manufacturing or assembly line facility in Mexico? Absolutely. And who's that going to benefit? It's going to benefit U.S. consumers. It's going to benefit U.S. companies. It's going to benefit foreign companies. You see what I say when I say that Mexico is the gateway to the United States, how much more dramatic that is now that I have shed some light on it. Much more dramatic. Don't forget that the flag follows the dollar. It happens, whether you like it or not, and we can get into a political debate another day. I'm sure there are good reasons for us doing some of the things that we do. But the reality of it is, I like cheap gasoline. That's just me. I don't know about you. I can only speak for myself. But I like cheap gasoline. I like cheap food, cheap or less expensive. I don't like cheap food. I like high quality food at a low price. What happened when NAFTA was implemented? You saw an influx of Mexican farmers coming into the United States, primarily because the United States subsidizes its farmers. Mexico does not subsidize their farmers. So when you subsidize, you give that industry a competitive advantage. It's only natural that U.S. farmers put Mexican farmers out of business. So now they're looking for work. So there are negatives. There are positives. There are negatives and positives, but the flag follows the dollar. I want you to keep that always in the back of your head. Any questions or comments? Any questions or comments thus far? Now, we talked a little bit earlier about entering into a market. Entering into a market. You notice how I said market, not country. What I'm really talking about is culture, right? Entering into a new culture. The first thing we really want to know is the customer, right? So we got to know the customer and customer's customer. We also have to have a dedicated team. Don't spread yourself too thin. We also have to have a dedicated team. But we also need to know and understand two things. Do they have money? And are they willing to spend it? Now, in the U.S., it's a pretty easy question. We don't have money and we're willing to spend it. U.S. consumers, I think our savings rate is starting to increase a little bit, but I can't tell you how many, you know, you drive around Scottsdale, I go to lunch, I can't tell you how many, you know, $30,000 a year millionaires there are. There's quite a few, you know, driving Lexus and whatnot, and yet their income isn't necessarily up to par with the, we'll call it, accessories that they have. So in the U.S., we may have money, we may not have money, but we're willing to spend it either way. In China, China has, as we know now, 1.4 billion people. There are a lot of Chinese that have money, and a lot of companies thought, wow, we're going to go into China and we're going to sell, oh my gosh, I mean, they've got so many more people than we do here. We're going to sell, we're going to be so busy, it's going to be, we're going to make so much money, it's going to be unbelievable. China is just really waking up to brands and consumer goods in terms of brands. It's not yet arrived in terms of fashion, in terms of brand. Now in the bigger cities, you go to Hong Kong, you go to Shanghai, you're going to see a lot of brands. But you go outside of those cities and the world becomes kind of gray. Not so much in terms of brands. It's what you need to live, not what you look like, that matters. It's what you need to live. And so a lot of companies went into China looking to sell their product, knowing that there were a lot of Chinese that had money. And they failed. They failed completely. Because they looked at it as just a numbers game. They looked at China and said, wow, 1.4 billion people. If we just get 5% of the market, we're going to, oh my gosh, we're going to be killing it. And that's the wrong way to look at entering into a market. That's the same approach, just so you know, that's the same exact approach as you going to the mall, you driving your vehicle to the mall, and you coming back out and you see a business card or a flyer on your windshield. That's the same approach. The individuals that are putting business cards or flyers on your windshield are saying, wow, the Chandler Fashion Square has on average of 5,000 cars there a day. If we put a flyer on each one of those and we get just 5% of the market, oh my gosh, 5% of the cars, it's going to be huge business. How many of you have ever called one flyer that you received at the mall? Very few. And yet that's the same mentality that a multinational corporation employed when they decided they were going to go into China. Wow, 1.4 billion people. If we just get 5% of the market, there's no difference. Is that amazing? I mean, that just boggles my mind. How they can have no cultural sensitivity and understand that mindset of, will they spend the money? Will they spend it? The question that you need to ask with this is not the percentage. That's not how you enter a market. I don't care if you've got a car washing detailing business or if you are Intel. You don't go into a market saying, if I can capture just 5% or 10% of the market. No. That's like me saying, oh, you know what, I just created a new GNOME, and there are 330 million people in the United States, and if I just get 10% of them, oh my, I'm pretty much set, right? That is ridiculous. The word that I want you to be very aware of is relevant. What is your relevant market? So there are 1.4 billion. So the question should have been, all right, so there are 1.4 billion people in China. How many of them are willing to spend money that have money? How many of them have maybe an affinity? Let's just say it's high-end watches. Let's just say it's a high-end watch, like a Patek Philippe. Do you think Patek Philippe says there's 1.4 billion people, we should get, hopefully we get 10% of them to buy our watch? The watch costs on average around $30,000 US. That's a low, it's a low end Patek. Double Tourbillon gravity movement watch that will last too long. No. They say, okay, well, how many individuals have this income that can afford this? And then number two, are they willing to spend it? What percentage of them can we get? Now you're cooking with gas. That's my thought they used to say. Now you're cooking with gas. All right, what is your relevant market? This is a mistake that I see a lot of companies make. A lot of companies make. I will tell you who is successful out there in China right now. GM. GM sells more vehicles in China than they do in the US. By far more vehicles in China than they do in the US. The majority of their revenue comes from China, comes from Asia. Now, the question that I have for you is, what is American? Is Toyota American? You might say, no, it's Japanese. I don't know. They employ more people than GM does here in the United States. They manufacture several vehicles here and in Mexico. Mexico is part of North America, by the way. So what is American? I don't know. I used to know. When I was a kid, I used to know. But now things have changed. I don't know what American is anymore, because I see companies like Honda and Toyota employing more people here, doing some good things, good paying, higher tech jobs. BMW has a plant in Alabama, as Tim states, making a specific vehicle. Do you see how globalization has kind of confused things? In a beautiful way, though. I love this. I love having to question BMW's. I'm sure they probably don't appreciate it. I'm sure Toyota doesn't appreciate me questioning whether or not they are German or Japanese. But I like asking the question. I might argue with the CEO of Toyota, given the chance, that he's more American than he knows or she knows. I would love to have that argument. It'd be a fun argument to have. Questions or comments? Questions or comments? Now, continuing along the lines of entering into a country. I'm sorry, entering into a what? A market or a culture. We need to have, what's this? An idea of how we're going to enter into a market. And we call it the triple constraint. And before we get into the triple constraint, Tim has a statement. Had we let our car companies fail, Toyota would have been the only American auto jobs left. That's a good point, Tim. I hadn't really thought of that. That's a really good point. That's a point that I'm going to use when I argue with the CEO of Toyota. He was this close to becoming, we were going to give him American citizenship. Would have been the only American car company. That would have been pretty sad too, but that's pretty funny. So the triple constraint, I'm going to laugh about that one for a while. The triple constraint is when we're entering into a market, we need to consider the scope, schedule, and cost. The scope is how you enter the market. And we'll get into that in a second. The schedule is when. Timing is so important. So important. So for instance, Vietnam just about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, they started opening up their markets. They started opening up their markets to foreigners, and now you see companies diving in head first. MNCs diving in head first. Before that, it would have been a real difficult, just given the whole political and regulatory issues that you would have had to jump through. But now it's much easier. And cost. We know cost is how much. But when we say how much, I am asking you what? How much what? We just went over it. Yes, and Vietnam is now part of the WTO, which is what precipitated all of this race to the bottom mentality where companies are diving in head first. MNCs are diving in to Vietnam. That's a great point, Artemis. That's a great point. But back to how much. What am I talking about here? And I see Tim typing. What am I talking about when I talk about how much? Bill? Total?
Yeah, the total cost, labor.
Of ownership.
Time, yeah.
Total cost of ownership. You see how if you take a little bit deeper dive, how you can get so much more specific? And we understand what the total cost of ownership is from some previous slides. Now, how might you enter? Quickly, Tim says, so we might eventually be buying Vietnamese goods the way the German and Japanese, the way we buy. Absolutely, absolutely. We already are. We already are. I haven't seen too many of them, but we already are bringing in goods from Vietnam. We already are. And again, remember, and you know, we tend to demonize Chinese, the Chinese. And we say, oh, they're taking all of our manufacturing jobs. Remember, 45% of all U.S. goods coming from China are made by U.S. companies. They're offshoring. Or maybe outsourcing. But it's U.S. companies. Do you see the hypocrisy here? I just don't want you to be disillusioned. We always have to have a boogeyman, it seems like. I don't think there needs to be a boogeyman. China is doing what we have asked them to do. China is a counterfeit economy. They are a copycat economy. They are a manufacturer. They're doing what we told them to do. Okay? So when you enter into a market like China, you have to think about, how am I going to go into China? I don't know anyone there. I don't speak. What do they speak in China? What's the language they speak? What's the primary language they speak in China? Mandarin. Absolutely. Mandarin. So how are we going to get into China? A JV might be good. What does a JV stand for? Joint venture. A joint venture is probably the best way to enter into an emerging market like China. Why would I say that a joint venture would be a great way versus just throwing a bunch of your money and people over there? why would I say that a joint venture would be probably the best way to do that? Anyone? Bueller? So I've got Tim and Artemis. I got multiple employees. This is fantastic. I love it. So we might eventually, because locals know the way, whoops, here we go. Because locals know the way to handle business there. There's one good reason. There's one good reason. Why else? The Chinese government requires it. In many cases, they do. I believe just recently, the Chinese government, within the last 6 months, allows you to come in, but you're still going to need a partner. They don't fully require it, but the reality of it is the landscape is such that you're still going to have to employ a partner of some sort. It also makes it a lot easier to know the market in China. All of this is so intuitive. It's so easy. And that's right. That's absolutely right. The only problem is you have to share that with somebody, right? But you're absolutely correct. It makes it a lot easier because they know the market. They understand the landscape. So a joint venture, for all intents and purposes, is probably, for the most part, the best way to enter into an emerging market. And that's, again, a general statement. It depends on how much money you have or don't have, right? Also, the people will want to work there if it benefits one of their country's businesses. Yeah, so there is a national pride issue as well. Good point. There's a national pride issue there as well. It's absolutely correct. I want us to also consider, in emerging markets, we talked about cultures having money and willing to spend it, right? Do they have money and willing to spend? We need to start talking in terms of purchasing power. I need you to start, when we're talking about international business, these are some of the terms. The triple constraint, we're going to take another deep dive in that as the semester goes on. But again, this is still bringing you up to speed so that once we get into the stream, we can really start moving. But purchasing power. Purchasing power. And really quick, didn't KFC attempt a joint venture a couple of years ago? KFC has been in China for at least a dozen years, I would say. At least a dozen years. And they decided to go it, not alone, but they decided to go into China without being very considerate of the Chinese culture and language. And so they hired somebody to translate, and I believe this was KFC that did this, made this mistake. They hired somebody to translate a literal translation of finger licking good. The literal translation of that ended up being, it tastes so good, you will bite your fingers off. And that was the advertisement billboard that showed up all over China. It tastes so good, you're going to bite your fingers off. They had no idea no idea that that's what it meant. They didn't take the time to look at the culture. Again, what do you think KFC was thinking? Well, if we can get 10% of the 1.4 billion people, yeah, have Sam, put Sam on it and have him translate it. Sam probably got on the internet and did a literal translation. Coca-Cola made a similar mistake. Coca-Cola's slogan years ago was something like brings your, what was it? It was something like, I forget the slogan, but I know the translation into China was, the literal translation was, brings your ancestors back from the dead. Brings your ancestors back from the dead. And I forget years ago what that Coca-Cola slogan was. It was something like, I forget. Somebody will remember. But nonetheless, that went out on the billboards all over. Think of Chevy when they introduced the Chevy Nova into Mexico in the late 60s. What does no va mean in Spanish? No go. How many Mexicans do you think bought a Nova? I will tell you, strangely, that my tata bought a Nova. And that was my first car. As a sidebar, my very first car when I was 16 was a 1969 Chevy Nova. And some of you might think, when I tell people this, I've had people say, wow, actually, that's a really cool car. And then I tell them, yeah, but I inherited the four-door. And then they're like, oh, they feel sorry for me all of a sudden. Oh, had it been the two-door, it would have been cool because it looked like a Chevelle, right? The four-door just looked like an extended version of a hippopotamus. But nonetheless, that was my first car, and my grandfather did buy a Chevy Nova. I don't know what the thinking was there exactly, but I assume that he knew that Nova was not, that wasn't the intended slogan, Nova, to not go. Anyway, moving right along. Let's see here. Where am I? Ah, yes. When we are thinking about entering into, and this is entering into a market continued. There are two things that drive your business. And this is especially true in international business. It was Pepsi, and it was
Come alive with the Pepsi generation.
Come alive. Thank you very much, Brian. So the slogan was, it was with Pepsi when they launched into China, come alive with the Pepsi generation. And I think the literal translation was, Pepsi will bring your ancestors back from the grave. So drink plenty of Pepsi if you want to see, your ancestors come out of the grave.
You're right about Coca-Cola, though. Coca-Cola sounded either bite the wax tadpole or emo horse stuffed with wax.
Yeah.
So they had to change
The name.
of it.
Yeah.
Luckily they found something.
Right. I've been to it was in Beijing or Shanghai. I don't remember, but I've been to a bottling plant, a Coca-Cola bottling plant in, I think it was in Shanghai. It was outside of Shanghai, I should say. And the name is not Coca-Cola because that sounds like something like a wax stuffed with tadpoles or something like that. But nonetheless, they did change the name to something more palatable to the culture. But why would they have had to gone through that mistake in the first place? You know, kind of ridiculous. Kind of ridiculous. Especially Pepsi. I mean, these companies have money, right? You would think they would have spent a little bit of it on understanding some of the cultural nuances. So, there are two things that drive your business. Not a triangle. Integration and responsiveness. Your ability to integrate into a culture is going to be linear to your ROI. Your ability or inability, I should say, to integrate into a culture. So the example that we just had with Pepsi and KFC. Initially, when they launched into China, they had some difficulty. And what do you think their ROI was with KFC when their billboard said, "We'll bite your fingers off"? It's so good you're going to bite your fingers off. Their ROI was probably not too terribly high, if at all. So your ability to integrate is going to be linear to your ROI. But with integration, I want you to consider how many things can you do similarly. By this I mean, let's just say that, let's go with high-end luxury items. When you sell a high-end luxury item, let's just say Rolex or a Patek Philippe or a Jaeger LeCouture. I think Jaeger LeCouture. I don't know how to, and my accent is not very good. I'm working on it. Which I would love to have that watch, by the way, hint. But do you think that they have to change, do they change the text? Does Rolex, if Rolex goes into, say, India, do they change the text so that it's a font in Hindi? Or is it going to be an English font? English characters, I should say. They don't change anything. Luxury items are very, very lucky in that the brand is such that it crosses cultures. And they don't have to change the characters to meet that language. You follow me? But what happens if it's clothing and a brand like Armani? Well, no, Armani is still a luxury item. Let's just say it's a brand, a lesser known brand. You're going to see it in the characters of that language, of that local culture, of that local country, right? Or of that country, I should say. So the question is, if you don't, actually the point is, the fewer things that you have to change, the better off you are. The less expense you're going to have to spend. So for instance, a few years ago, I was helping a local company sell a product into Canada. And you think, well, okay, they speak English. But Canada has an interesting regulatory law that requires you to also put your directions, your ingredients, your instructions in what other language? French, exactly right. Into French. So they had to go through the expense of figuring out where on the box, because it has to be on the box. Where on the box were they going to put it? And some of their product didn't have a box. It wasn't enclosed. Like, let's take shampoo. When you go to a store, let's say Walgreens, you'll see some shampoos in a box, and you'll also see some shampoos that you can just pull out right there. It's in the shape of whatever, and you don't have to change anything. It's in English. Well, think of the added expense that this company had to go through, because it has to be in French and in English. So they had to actually put it into a box so they could fit all of the ingredients in English and in French on one label. The expense was by no means exorbitant, but they had to get it right. And that also cost them time to the market. Competitors were selling while they were figuring out how to translate certain ingredients. And then you have these ingredients that might be, how do you translate certain ingredients into French? I mean, that's a whole different ball of wax. Tim, what's your question? Do you think Spanish would be legislated to be put on some products in the U.S., such as medication? No. No, I don't think that it will be. I don't think there's any need for it, number one. But unless it's coming from Mexico, Mexico would have to put it into English. I don't really see that as really being a need. I just don't at this point. But it is in Canada. It is in Canada. There, you know, I don't know how many French-speaking people there are on the western side of Canada, but there isn't that many. But you have to have that labeling everywhere in Canada if you want your product sold. Everywhere. But who wants medications from Mexico? Well, that's a good question, Artemis. I would probably drive you down to Sun City or Sun Lakes. There are a lot of people that take buses. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are a lot of elderly that take these day shuttle buses to Nogales to do what? Buy meds. Every day there are truckloads of vans filled with elderly that are going to Mexico and buying meds because it's less expensive. It's less expensive. Let's look at why it's less expensive. Let's take Pfizer, for instance. Pfizer makes Viagra, right? Pfizer makes Viagra. Do you think they sell Viagra for the same price in India to Indians as they do to U.S. citizens? You think they sell it for the same price in Mexico? No, there's variations depending on the purchasing power of that culture. You know, what is it that they can make? And purchasing power is really, when I'm talking about purchasing power, I'm talking about disposable income. I'm talking about, after all of your expenses, how much funny money do you have? You know, how much are you going to save? How much are you going to spend on other stuff that you want? Well, purchasing power is, so is it a purchasing power play and not a volume of sales play? Well, with Viagra, it's a volume play, and they recognize that if a certain country or market, we're going to say, if a certain market can't, you know, they don't have the same income as, let's say, France, then you're going to want to still sell it, so sell it for a lower price. To that, let's say it's in Morocco. Do you think that Viagra is in Morocco? Yeah, it's in Morocco. It probably sells for a lot less than what it sells for in Germany. So it's both a play on the purchasing power and volume, because Pfizer knows that they only have a certain amount of time before their product becomes a generic product, before their patent expires, and I believe that's 10 years. So back to two things that drive your business: integration and responsiveness. How many things can I do similarly? And what I must do differently. How responsive can you be? So, you know, this is where Rolex is going to be, luxury items. So they don't need to do a lot differently. And how many things can they do similarly? A lot. They don't have to change anything. That's the ideal situation. That's where you want to be. The fewer changes you have to make to your product, the better. Out here, we're going to have more local products. And give me an example of a local product. I gave you one on Tuesday. Give me one example of a local product. That means a global company. There you go, Coca-Cola. When you buy a Coca-Cola in Nogales, it's going to be highly carbonated. It's going to taste like the Coca-Cola you're going to buy in Pittsburgh. But you go across the line, Nogales, to Nogales, Mexico, and now what's that Coca-Cola going to taste like? Less, yeah, it's going to taste like sugarcane. Is that what you said? Yeah, it's going to be a lot less carbonated, a lot sweeter. That's local. And they sell those now at Costco too. That's right. They sell those now at Costco as well. I don't know. There are a lot of people that love it. I mean, they're selling it. So there are a lot of people that really like the sweet, syrupy taste. I haven't gotten to that point yet. I try to stay away from pops. But nonetheless, all right. Back to this. The less change, the greater your ROI. Okay, so with integration and responsiveness, the less you have to change, the greater your return on investment will be. Okay? Makes you better. Okay. I might have to try it. Now you're enticing me. All right. Questions or comments thus far? Questions or comments thus far? We're rolling along pretty nicely. The key here is assimilation. The key is assimilation. So research before you're entering a market of the U.S. Yeah, research any market, even in the U.S. Your research, and actually, you know what, Artemis, you bring up a very good point. When I talk to you about market, I'll bring this back in a second. What was my definition of marketing that you are going to remember for the rest of your life, regardless of what anybody else tells you. What's the definition of marketing? What is the definition of marketing? I hear crickets. We went over this on Tuesday. The definition of marketing, boy, oh boy. Ben is going to pull everybody out. No. It's all about the moms. Yeah, that's the second step. That's the second step, Ben. Marketing, the definition of marketing is it's a call to action. It's a call to action. Right? Now, marketing is the research. And then advertising is the end result of that research. I want you to be able to make that distinction because and it's okay to use marketing in terms of we use it loosely. If we see a TV ad or a radio ad, oftentimes I'll hear somebody say, oh, hey, did you hear that marketing piece they did? That was fantastic. Well, what is it that they really mean to say? Did you hear that advertising? That really sounded good. That's the difference. That's the difference. Marketing is research that leads to advertising. And this is your definition. Now I know that some of you are not paying as much attention. That is going to be a quiz. I'm going to be like, I don't know, I'm probably dating myself again, but I don't know how many of you, I was looking at my 8th grade yearbook last night. I don't know why, I was cleaning some stuff out, and I saw in my 8th grade yearbook that the #1 favorite movie of my 8th grade class was Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I don't know, some of you may not even have heard of it. But in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, there was a teacher called Mr. Hand. And if you get the question wrong, incorrect on the quiz, what is marketing? I am going to come to your house for the summer, and I am going to sit there with you and eat your food and teach you all day long. I'm going to be your Mr. Hand. Okay? So don't get that wrong. Back to global marketing. Assimilation. When we're going through cultures and we're trying to understand the topography or the landscape of a particular culture, we're really looking at how do we best assimilate? How do we get our brand to be accepted by that culture? Integration and responsiveness. Those are the drivers. How do we do that? You see, if you understand the mindset of a particular target market, let's just say, as Ben stated, let's just say it's mothers in India, in Bombay, India, specifically from the age of 40 to 45. If you understand their mindset, you'll be able to create an advertisement that elicits an emotional trigger that brings a call to action to purchase your product, which then gives you the ROI that you're looking for, and thus you have a sale. If you know how they think, you can create ads that resonate with your consumer, with your target market. That's what it's all about. That's why cultural having a high cultural IQ, and we'll go over more of that as the semester goes on, is critical to the success of your business. I don't know how many of you have taken my class, but my marketing class, but marketing is really an art. And a lot of people pawn it off as, because it's not a science, it's looked at as some fuddy-duddy people that make stuff up and whatnot. And it's really a whole psychology. And we'll get into this in the latter part of the semester, but it's the psychographics of the demographics. It's knowing how your target market thinks, your target market being the demographic. So it's not enough to know that it's Indian women in Bombay from age 40 to 45. It's not enough to know that that's who you're targeting to. You have to understand, you have to know the psychographics of the demographics. You have to know how they think. Think in culture. And that's what assimilation is. To think in culture. Okay? In this context. In this context. I don't know. I think that was, if I remember correctly, Hey Bud Let's Party. I thought that was Fast Times, not Animal House. But I could be wrong. Now I'm going to have to watch it again. Any questions or comments? Any questions or comments thus far? We've gone through a lot of information today. I'm going to keep pushing forward. I'm going to keep pushing forward if you don't have any questions or comments. Now, let's talk a little bit about barriers to entry. And I want you to think about, when you're thinking about barriers to entry, I want you to keep in the back of your mind total cost of what? Total cost of what? Ownership. Okay? They are somewhat related. Capital. Do you have the capital to actually launch into a country? That's your first barrier, is capital. Does your organization have the resources in terms of capital to launch into a country? You know what's great is that with the democratization of information and technology, you don't need a lot of capital to launch into a country. Let's say somebody were to create some gnomes, hypothetically. Who would create gnomes? Let's just say somebody were to create some gnomes. Do you think it would be relatively easy to open up an online store in, say, Germany and start having a presence in that country to maybe sell? Yeah, it takes some time and it takes some money, but it doesn't take huge resources. You see how small companies, SMEs, can compete with MNCs? But capital is definitely a barrier to entry. It might cost you a few grand to really get it right, to translate culturally, not just literally. But it's not going to cost you millions and prevent you from getting in there. Capital is number one. Regulation. regulation is number 2. What do I mean by regulation? What do I mean by regulatory? What kind of barriers might you experience there with the regulatory environment? Anyone? It's not just about fulfilling the regulatory government restrictions. There you go, Tim. Randy, what are you saying? Foreign red tape? Excellent. Excellent. You know, in other countries, I call them, and I'm not advocating this at all, but we're talking about bribery. We're talking about bribery. A few years ago, I was assisting a company launching into India, and their product was a personal lubricant. And that product is not culturally acceptable in India right now. It's starting to be. And in India, they had their FDA is called the DCI, the Drug Controller of India. And they did not have, about 4 years ago, they did not have a category that a lubricant could fit into. They didn't even have a dietary category or supplement. We'll call it a supplement category. And it turns out that I was in Bombay. I had to fly to Delhi to meet the Drug Controller of India. One individual controlled whether or not this product was going to get in or not, which meant that he was going to have to create a whole new category, which meant that he was going to have to do more work, right? The head of the DCI, I'm not talking about somebody within the DCI, I'm talking about the head of the DCI, their FDA I had to meet. So I go there with my business partner, Vishal, who's from Bombay, and I wasn't allowed into the meeting because as an American, they know and understand that Americans aren't going to participate or partake in bribery, which I wasn't. But my business partner understood that. And he said to me, Aram, you know, we could walk away from this and nothing will ever happen, or we could pay to actually have this happen. And I said, no, we don't want to pay to have this happen. Wait, you can't see me. We don't want to pay to have this happen. I have nothing to do with this. Whatever you need to do, you do. But I would like to expedite this also. So I call them expedition costs, expedite costs. Sometimes I've had products stuck shipping from the U.S., manufactured here in the U.S. to India, stuck in customs for some unknown reason. I don't know how it got out of customs, but I suspect that Vishal employed the expedite cost. We call it the FedEx model. You pay more to get things done quicker, right? Shipped quicker. I know that Craig Barrett, who the Honors College is named after here at ASU, had some issues when he went into Costa Rica. he decided to open up a facility in Costa Rica and negotiated with the president of Costa Rica. Everything was going great. They built the facility. They started sending down large quantities of equipment. And all of a sudden, his employees were telling him, hey, this is all stuck in customs. And he said, well, wait a minute. What the heck? What do you mean it's stuck in customs? Yeah, they won't let it out of customs. So he had a personal conversation with the president of Costa Rica. President Figueres was his name, and basically told him, you're going to move that out of customs. I don't know if there were any expedite costs involved or not. I don't think there were, because Intel was such a huge player for a country like Costa Rica. But even a company like Intel has issues with customs or with regulatory. You need to be aware that regulation isn't just about laws and regs that you need to abide by. Sometimes it's about being able to do business in a country. And as U.S. citizens, I can tell you that you are not to, and you will not partake in any kind of bribery. All right, number 3. Another barrier to entry when you launch into a country, and we talked about this with Vietnam, is expertise. Yeah, these kind of costs come up in the U.S. Wow, yep. I'm not going to comment on that. But in Vietnam, expertise, we're talking about low-skilled or no-skilled individuals. So although you go into a country thinking that you're going to have these ridiculously low costs, and then you realize all of a sudden that you got to train everybody. They don't know anything about how efficiencies work or even what efficiency is. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. How about accessibility? How accessible is the market? I'm going to give you the difference. This is my own personal knowledge, so it may change. It is changing. But in India versus China, China has a fantastic infrastructure system. Their infrastructure, there are roads being built out to the middle of nowhere. There are rails being built, good roads, not like, potholed roads, really great roads. Their infrastructure is really, really strong. In India, on the other hand, you could be in the middle of Bombay and fall down a manhole. And there's no sign or anything. It's like you need an SUV, like one of those pre-runners, or a Toyota Land Cruiser to get around. No kidding. No kidding. I'm not kidding at all. So accessibility, how easy is it to get to your market? That's a barrier to entry. If it's difficult to get your product or service to a particular area, that's a barrier to entry. Okay? Manufacturing. The proximity to the market is a key point. Think of why companies manufacture in Mexico. Why do they manufacture in Mexico? Why would a company like, say, I don't know, let's just say hypothetically, and I don't know if let's say Michelin, Volkswagen. Why would Volkswagen manufacture in Mexico? Money, what do you mean? Expand on that, Brian. General cost of labor is low, but also proximity to market. Also proximity to market. Cream. That's how you remember this. It'll be on your quiz. Capital, regulation, expertise, accessibility, manufacturing. Regulatory costs are lower and no EPA. They are starting to have, I think, some EPA, I don't know what it is in Mexico, but they are starting to employ EPA type stuff. And that's being driven by US companies, believe it or not, in a lot of ways. Interestingly enough. Okay, now, I'm going to halt it here. I'm going to pause it here for a second because I wanted to go over a dynamic, a global dynamic. Again, this is a real-world, real-time class. So, China, when they entered the WTO in 94 or 95 or 93, I forget what year it was, they were in the dark ages for almost a century. And I mentioned in the last class that the Chinese are the greatest capitalists to have ever walked the earth. And that's true. That's true. There's no question in my mind that that's true. But again, at what cost? Their environment it's just, I don't know how they live there. It's just been a mess. 80% of the rivers and streams are unpotable. You know, in Beijing, it's so bad. I think I sent out an article last semester, a couple of months ago, about how the measurement of pollution, it's not even measurable in Beijing. It was off the charts. And when I was there in Beijing you could see from here to the end of this, to the door of this classroom, which is probably 30 feet, you could see the pollution. It was like, I mean, you could cut it, it almost seemed like you could cut it with a knife. You could see the pollution. They have gone from being in the dark ages, from 0 to 60, to the second largest GDP in the world for a country in 20 years. Less than 20 years. That says something about their ingenuity. It says something about their capitalism. And yet we don't particularly get along. Our political systems are different. We have a democracy. They operate really more off of communism, if you will. Well, they definitely have a communistic political system. But it goes to show you that you don't have to have democracy in order to have capitalism, right? I was having a conversation this morning right before class with a buddy of mine in China. He was just coming back from a bar. And he's in Shenzhen. And he was telling me about how the government is really pushing entrepreneurship. But he was also saying how many people almost don't even have a choice. The government, in his words, owns you. And they will, by that, they will help you open up a business. And a lot of it will be government owned. You will be running it. And you basically now are going to be working as an entrepreneur, whether you like it or not. That's different. That's a different sort of capitalism. And it brings to mind questions about social unrest, which they have. It brings to mind a lot of other issues. There are numerous bubbles, and a bubble is classified as inflation in an asset class. We saw a bubble, we saw inflation in real estate prices several years ago. We're seeing prices in housing right now increase dramatically and quickly. I don't think to the point, though, that we saw before. That was precipitated by a lot of really bad loans. I think there's a real need for people to want to have their own house. It's an asset, so it's probably the best investment you can ever make. But China is sitting on multiple bubbles. Multiple bubbles. In Shanghai, I remember being in a meeting, and I was sitting there. I was listening to a speaker, and I was in a high-rise. And Shanghai, if you haven't been there, Shanghai, when I first got there, honestly, I expected to see cars flying in the air. It was like the Jetsons. It was so cool. It was so cool. Such a cool city. And I remember sitting in this meeting, and I was looking out the window of this high-rise, and I could see in the high-rise next to us, that there were only a few lights on, and almost the whole building was vacant. And so I got up during this gentleman's speech because I was really curious, and I went to the back and looked through another window and saw another high-rise, the same thing. Only a few vacant tenants in this giant 50, 60, 80-story high-rise. And then I did that for the next 10 minutes and noticed that there just wasn't a lot of occupants. It was highly vacant. So I couldn't get any straight answers because the Chinese government was trying to displace Hong Kong, and they put a lot of money into Shanghai. They want Shanghai to become the financial center, which it really isn't working out that way. But Shanghai has a lot to offer, and there's a lot of good stuff. But I ended up asking a taxi cab driver. I said, I noticed that there's a lot of vacancy. What do you think about that? And he said, and I don't know what his background was, but he just didn't seem like a normal taxi cab driver. He told me that roughly 60 to 70% of all buildings in Shanghai were vacant. That's a huge number. Yet the perception is that there's maybe only 20 or 30% vacancy, because that's what they want you to see. That's what they want you to hear. It was the complete opposite. And he asked me to tell him that I would not repeat what he said with his name. I couldn't even read his name, even if I wanted to. But I had a promise that I wasn't going to use his information associated with his name. Fair enough. Fair enough. Let's contrast that with India. India is the back office of the world. China is the manufacturer of the world. India went straight to a service-based economy. I mentioned to you earlier on Tuesday that the U.S. has moved beyond our industrial manufacturing prowess into a knowledge-based economy, which is more service-based oriented. That's who I think we're really competing with. people say, oh, Aram, China owns us. They control about $800 billion worth of our debt. Oh, China this, China. All I hear about is China. That's just not true. That's just not true. China does own about $800 billion worth of our debt, but why do they own $800 billion worth of our debt? It's because our dollar is used very much like people buy gold as a source of stability for their currency. So it's not that they control us. I mean, think about it. They're buying our debt because their currency, the RMB or the yuan, is not readily liquid. And a currency is supposed to be, it's supposed to provide you with two things. A currency is supposed to provide you with liquidity and confidence. That's why the US dollar is the primary currency used when oil is bought or sold, when oil is traded. Roughly 70 to 80% of petrodollars, as they're called, are really US dollars. The rest are euros. I'm a little more, I don't want to say concerned, because I do business in India, I do business in China. I want to say that China is not the boogeyman that we make them out to be. They're still a manufacturing force. India, on the other hand, is a service-based economy, which is a knowledge-based economy, which is what the US is. So do you see why I would say I think we should be a little more concerned about India? But India, on the other hand, doesn't have the infrastructure. So when we talk about the hegemon, again, I don't want this to be a patriotic speech, but when we talk about the hegemon, although China has the second largest GDP in the world, it doesn't mean that China is going to overtake the US as the hegemon just because they have the second largest GDP. They're not even close to being a knowledge-based economy. India, on the other hand, is down on the food chain when it comes to GDP, but they are a knowledge-based economy. Here's the other thing. China has an aging population, very much like the US. We have an aging population. India has a very young population, Where the US is going to benefit, and again, this isn't about politics, but where the US will benefit is Mexico has, and India have but Mexico has one of the youngest populations on the planet, an eager workforce. We have an aging population in the US. At some point that's going to come into play. But India has a competitive advantage in that they have a very young population. China's trying to figure out what they're going to do with what they're doing with all of their elderly. I think that's one of the things that we're kind of going through now in the US. So understand the dynamic. And again, that's a little bit more of my experience and a little bit of my opinion is I'm a little more concerned about India. I like their competitive nature. I like their competitiveness. And believe you me, they are competitive. The global landscape is not flat. It's not without its mountains and valleys. It's up to us as internationalists. It's up to us as individuals that work in global commerce to figure out what those valleys and mountains and hills look like so we can navigate through them. The more that you understand that, the more of a picture you have, of an illustration, the clearer that mosaic becomes. And that will be linear to your ROI. And again, ROI is one of my least favorite words, return on investment. It's a dead beaten horse, but just know that it is linear. Without any further ado, we're going to finish class right here. I'm going to leave it open for a minute for Q&A. Tim says, the dollar is a long-term stable instrument. Well, you know, Tim, here, okay, I'm gonna bring it back. We're not done yet. You bring up a really good point. A really good point. The dollar is a long-term stable instrument. Here's what I want you to understand. I hear a lot that we have a weak dollar. Weak against what? Stable against what? Against the yen? Against the rupee? Against the RMB? Against the euro? What is the dollar stable compared to? You can't tell me that the dollar is weak or the dollar is strong. Now, there's also another way to do this. You can say there are two ways to identify whether the dollar is weak or strong. You, number one, compare it to a currency, okay? So, compared to what? Or, compared to when? Does the dollar buy the same amount of groceries that it did? Is $100 worth of, is $100 going to buy you the same amount of groceries it did 5 years ago? No. Food inflation has gone up. The purchasing power of that dollar has gone down a little bit. Not by a lot. Not by a lot. Marginally. So when you say the dollar is weak, or somebody says the dollar is weak, I want you to say weak compared to what? Weak compared to 1978? Weak compared to 2008? Weak compared against the yen? Is it stable against, weak against what or strong against what? The dollar right now is in great shape. Compared to what? Okay? We can't say that it's good or bad unless we compare it to two things. So we see this on CNBC or whatever news service that you subscribe to every single day. I hear a general statement about the dollar. And that's ridiculous. That's a fantastic statement in that it's so far out it makes no sense. I don't even know what to make of it when I hear it. So when somebody says the dollar is strong or the dollar is weak, you have to say, whoa, okay, the dollar is weak against what? The dollar is weak against when? What is it that you're referencing? Because you need to know. You need to know. All right? You can't just make a unilateral statement and say, oh, the government's printed way too much money and inflation is coming. That hasn't happened yet. Inflation, everything is cyclical anyways. People just don't understand the timing. You just have, and I don't understand timing. No one can predict it. But you have to qualify these statements with when and against what. Okay. Great point, Tim. I appreciate that. Any questions or comments? Any questions or comments? This is going to be on the quiz. So essentially what's going to happen is I believe I believe I am going to upload the quiz for you on Saturday morning at 12 a.m. So around 11:59 p.m. on Friday night, 12 a.m. Saturday morning, the quiz will be uploaded. It's going to be a heavy quiz. You will have until 11:59 p.m. Sunday evening to submit it to the Dropbox. There will be a designated Dropbox for quiz 1. It will cover all of the notes. Everything that we talked about. It's going to be a big quiz. The first few quizzes are pretty heavy because, again, it's about acclimating you to global business. The NIK was down 7% last night, and they say due to Chinese manufacturing slowing. Could that be the only reason for such a huge drop? So you're talking about the Nikkei, the exchange, the Nikkei, the Japanese exchange. Yeah, that most likely is the reason why manufacturing in China, the Chinese economy is slowing, and naturally so. They can't keep up the pace of 9.8% growth annually, year on year. But that is probably why. Japan is also in a different situation financially, economically than we are here in the U.S. That's a great point. What kind of questions will be on the quiz? Good question, Ben. You're going to have a lot of triangles. You're going to have some fill in the blank. You're going to have some multiple choice. And if you concentrate on the notes and you've listened to the recordings, you're going to do just fine. Just fine. No question about it. Geometry, yes. PDF, oh, thank you, Tim. Yes, you have to submit into the Dropbox your quiz as a PDF. As a PDF. Okay, do not submit it as a Word doc. It will not be accepted. It needs to be submitted as a PDF. Thank you, Tim. You're absolutely right. What else am I forgetting, Tim? I think that's pretty much the long and short of it. Great session, great week. Class 1 and Class 2, week 1, fantastic. You guys knocked it out of the park. For those of you who don't know, you can type in them and say this PDF. Yeah, thank you, Tim. Appreciate that. All right, over and out. Same time, same channel, Tuesday, 10 a.m. See you soon.